Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about civil rights. Civil rights, I usually spend 3 days on it in class. I'm going to just get through this in whatever the 15 minutes I have for this video, or less. So, not really probably doing it justice, but I want to hit the key points that could be on the AP test and make sure you know some of the real basics that we should know as Americans. Now, civil rights, in this infamous case, Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, basically says that separate but equal facilities are okay. So that if schools or public buildings or whatever want to create two separate facilities, and one's for blacks, one's for whites, then that's okay, as long as they're equal. But they never were equal, and the conditions were usually pretty bad. Well, that case gets overturned in the famous 9-0 decision, with Earl Warren as the Chief Justice in Brown versus Board of Education. And I should actually say Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Yes, that's right. So 1954, Earl Warren's the Chief Justice, and he is going to make sure that this is a unanimous decision, and it's going to overturn Plessy and say essentially that separate facilities are never equal, and he's going to get rid of the separate schools. Now, one of the things with this decision is it's rightfully considered to be a great decision, but school districts were not really sure how fast. I mean, this came out early in the year 1954, which meant schools had really already started planning for 1955, and the school districts weren't sure. Well, how soon should we desegregate it? Because it may take us a while to get faculty moved around and students moved around and new bus routes and all that sort of stuff. So they went to the Supreme Court again the next year, and the next year in Brown versus Board of Education 2, the court said school systems need to desegregate, and the quote was, with all deliberate speed. This was, to many, a racist decision. It kind of offset the importance of the case in 1954, where Brown versus Board of Education had said, desegregate schools. And then in 1955, they say, with all deliberate speed. Many people realized that when you said deliberate and then speed, that those could sort of contradict each other. And basically what the court was saying was, no rush at all, and you're desegregating, take your time. And that was 1955, and so schools for the most part in the South were not desegregated in 1956 and 1960 and 1965, and so it took a very, very long time, and it wasn't really here until the 70s, Swan versus Charlotte, Mecklenburg County, where they forced busing of students in the South here in North Carolina, where they basically, here in this case, in the Swan case, the court said you can bus students from black areas to white areas to black areas to try to desegregate schools. You could force that busing, make it mandatory. In the case below, Milliken v. Bradley, a lot of the northern cities were upset that they were involved in this busing process when they felt like they were not the ones who were discriminating. And so after lots of race riots in the North, the court said in 1979, well, you don't have to bus in places that have no history of de jure segregation. So, which basically meant you don't have to bus in the North. De jure segregation is segregation by law. And so Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg said you can use forced busing to desegregate schools. And in Milliken v. Bradley, they said, but you don't have to do it in the North. And so the two types of segregation are de facto segregation, which is based on the circumstance and the facts. This happens to be segregated. So if you had a section of a city that was racially one group or another just because they chose to live near each other, and that created black or white schools, then that's one thing. De jure segregation would be laws saying that it had to be segregated in a certain way. And so the North generally had only de facto segregation, while the South had a history of de jure segregation. And so they were forced to continue busing for a while. Now after these cases, in the Brown versus Board of Education cases, like I said, schools were not desegregated in the 60s. And in 1971, when my father graduated from Providence College in Rhode Island, he was recruited by a southern school district in South Carolina. He was recruited to go down there and to desegregate an all-black school. So my dad went down there with one other teacher, one other white teacher, and the two teachers were the only white people in the building. And I have all kinds of stories I like to tell in class about the experience down there, where my father taught for several years, for 9 years, I believe, at an all-black school in outside Kingstree, South Carolina. And it never had any white students in it, but the way they reported the numbers, they fudged it so that it looked like they did. And so that's where I was born, down there in an all-black area of very rural South Carolina. And so when we left and moved away in 1978, or 1979, I guess, or so, when we moved away, there was still an all-black school. And so when we talk about desegregation happening in 1954, it was it didn't really happen that fast. There was the South resisted it. Now, and so hopefully we'll have a class discussion where we can talk a little bit more about that. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, probably the most important law that we cover in this class. That one is going to ban all segregation, discrimination in public facilities. And so public facilities meant public buildings, government buildings, but it also meant any building, any facility open to the public. So that would be, like I said, McDonald's, Holiday Inn, a sports stadium, anything that, even if it was privately owned, they still could not discriminate if the average person could come in off the street. So that was a monumental decision. And then in 1965, the Voting Rights Act will end a lot of the Jim Crow laws that were still in place in terms of voting. And so in 1965, the Voting Rights Act will basically say no poll taxes, no literacy tests. It will get rid of the grandfather clauses. It will also send federal workers to the South to register black voters and make sure they're being allowed to vote, that they will be allowed to vote. And so really it's the presidential election of 1968 that's the first time when most black people, at least in half the country, get the right to vote, at least in 100 years. And so the Voting Rights, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 expands rights just overall for black people in America. And the Voting Rights Act will allow black people in the South to vote for the first time. And finally, affirmative action. Affirmative action, many of our students at Green Hope, dealing with that, at least feel like they are. A lot of people feel like it either hurts them or helps them in college admissions. Affirmative action is taking positive steps towards helping a disadvantaged minority group sort of move forward. And there's a lot we can talk about where it came from and how it started and all that, but it basically starts in the 60s, and it is used often, in college admissions. And so two cases that come up. The first one is the most famous affirmative action case, Regents University of California v. Bakke. And in this case, a man felt that he did not get into medical school because of affirmative action hurt him. He was a white man. And the court basically in this case said, you know what, too bad, we're going to allow affirmative action. But what they did do is they ended any kind of quota that a university might have. So if a university said, we're going to make sure in every incoming class that we have 200 Hispanics and 300 African Americans, and and go through different races. They said you can't do that. You can't put a definite number, because that might cause somebody to, if there are two people and a white person or an Asian person's here, an Hispanic or a Native American or somebody is here, and the university feels like this is an underrepresented group, then they could give them a slight boost. But by disallowing quotas, what the court is saying is, if you say, we're going to have 100 of whatever race in this incoming class, and we get to 98's here, and 97's here, and 96 is here, and you start to go way down. I should go in the reverse order, but you're at number 99, and then you're looking for your 100th person. Well, it may be way, way down here. And what you want to avoid is that number, because that doesn't seem to be fair. So what the court basically says is race can be a factor when you are determining admissions. Grutter v. Bollinger, I wouldn't really worry about that one, but the court again reinforced the idea, or backed up the idea that affirmative action was okay. They didn't really like the point system that was being used in that case, but affirmative action is still allowed. It is still allowed and encouraged in college admissions and hiring. And so, again, can be very controversial to many out there. And then U.S. v. Virginia, I'm going to hold off on that one. I don't want to confuse you with too many of these, but in terms of rights for women going to military schools. So thank you for paying attention, and I hope that we will have a session where I can go over a lot more of the specifics that I think you will find pretty interesting in this chapter.